Okay, this, what I'm going to offer in the next 30 minutes or so is a short history of secular Buddhism. I think the story of secular Buddhism begins with the parable of the city. We find this in the Samyutta Nikaya, the connected discourses of the Buddha, in which he describes himself as somebody who went into a forest and stumbled across the ruins of an ancient path, and he followed that ancient path until he came to the ruins of an ancient city, and then was inspired by having seen these ruins to go to the king and the ministers of that time and ask them to consider rebuilding that city. And the king and the ministers help rebuild that city, and then it once again becomes full of people and prosperous and with beautiful parks and groves and strong ramparts and all of the things that you would expect of a city. When Gautama interprets that parable, he says that the path that he came across in the jungle was in fact the Noble Eightfold Path, which we'll be looking at in some detail later. And it was this Eightfold Path that led to the city. He doesn't say much about the city at all. It's very sketchy. But what is, I think, striking about this parable is that we find that the Noble Eightfold Path, or the practice of the Dharma, has as its goal not the ending of suffering or nirvana. It has as its goal the rebuilding and the flourishing of a city. Now, scholars feel that parables like this probably go back to a very early period. They tend to be a way of speaking, whether it's in Christianity or in Buddhism or elsewhere, that is really addressing the imagination. It's not a way of speaking to, professional scholars or intellectuals. It's picture, thinking in pictures. And these pictures are very powerful. They communicate far more than just factual information. They communicate a vision of what, in this case, the Dharma is about. And from this starting point, we can envision the Dharma as the basis for a new kind of civilization in this world. You have to remember that this was a process occurring at the Buddha's time in the 5th century BC in India, where the very first cities of the Eastern Gangetic area were coming into existence. And most of the Buddha's followers, particularly the lay followers, were living in these cities. These cities were those that supported the main monastic centers of Buddhism as well. So there are considerable grounds on which we can think of the Dharma not as a world-renouncing religion that leads you to eternal peace and nirvana, but as a practice, both individually and communally, that establishes the beginnings of another way of living in the world together in urban environments, in civilized environments. We also have another text which you'll find in your selected texts. It's number 3. And this is a statement the Buddha makes in a very early period. According to the text itself, it's shortly after his awakening, and he has fallen ill, and Mara comes along and suggests that now's the time to enter nirvana and to die. And the Buddha says, "I will not leave this world until I have men and women mendicants, men and women adherents, who are accomplished, trained, skilled, learned, knowers of the Dharma, trained in the Dharma, walking in the path of the Dharma, who will pass on what they have gained from their teacher, teach it, declare it, establish it, expound it, analyze it, make it clear, until they shall be able by means of the Dharma to overcome the false teachings that have arisen and thereby communicate the miraculous Dharma. Now, what is striking about this passage is that the Buddha makes no distinction between the role of the monk, the nun, the layman, or the lay woman. That all four, this fourfold Sangha, are to be trained in the Dharma, they'll pass on the Dharma, they'll teach the Dharma, and thereby become, as it were, people engaged in the process of creating this new culture or civilization. This passage, I think, is very telling because it doesn't split the community into the experts, namely the monastics or the mendicants, as I call them, and the lay people, or as I prefer to call them, the adherents. All four, men, women, lay people, monastics, have the same responsibilities. You don't have experts teaching the laity, which is, of course, in many ways what Buddhism then developed into. Now, we know quite a lot about how the monastics at the Buddha's time lived, because their rules and the various details about their lives have come down to us in quite some detail in different canonical texts. And so when you read the Pali Canon, and particularly if you read the Vinaya, which is the monastic, the text about the monastic life, you get a very vivid picture of what it would have been like to be a monastic at the Buddha's time, but you have a very, very vague picture of what it would have been like to be a man or a woman adherent, as someone who had no interest in joining a monastic community, but lived in the world. So this leaves a kind of a big gap in one ways. We know there must have been thousands probably of non-monastic men and women who supported the monastics, who built their monasteries, who kept kept the economy of the community going. But we have virtually no idea of how these people actually lived. We don't know what they did for cultural activities. We don't know what they did in their spare time. We don't know what kind of meditation practices that they might have done. We really know very little about them. We have a record that was preserved in the monastic communities because they had the leisure and the expertise to memorize texts and pass them on from generation to generation. And inevitably that has over time privileged the perspective of monastics. Apart from some carved inscriptions that record the names of donors in certain rock-cut temples in India, we virtually have no knowledge of how these lay people lived, what kinds of communities they had, and so forth and so on. So in this way, however the Dharma might have started out as the beginnings of a new civilization with a very egalitarian fourfold community, the record that has come down to us doesn't present that complete picture, but instead gives us a very detailed account of how monks lived, how nuns lived, and how their practice and their philosophy would lead them to liberation. So during this course, over the next few weeks, I'm going to present a case that there must have been a thriving non-monastic community of adherents. And this would have included artisans, business people, doctors, government officials, traveling merchants, a whole gamut of different occupations and lifestyles that would have been included amongst the community of adherents. And my argument, which will be central to what we're going to explore, is that these people lived their lives according to a model of the Dharma that was based on four paths, rather than four truths. Now, this is something we will come to actually in the second semester, the nature of these four paths. I'm not going to get into that now. But what happened in the history of Buddhism is this idea of there being these four paths was basically lost in Theravada Buddhism. You find no mention of this in the Pali texts, but this idea survived, albeit in a somewhat garbled form, in another early Buddhist school called the Sarvastivada. And the Sarvastivada tradition was the one that subsequently made its way into Tibet and also into China. And so the four paths we find in Mahayana Buddhism in Tibet and China, but we don't find it in the Pali materials. So one of the things we'll be exploring towards the end of the course is what went on here and what are these four paths, and most specifically, how do they relate to what I call the four tasks? We'll find they relate quite closely. And this early community that was practicing these four paths was basically a secular as opposed to a religious movement. And in that sense, I feel it to be the forgotten precursor of what we're calling secular Dharma, which is a practice founded on a task-based ethics, which constitutes four paths, rather than a truth-based metaphysics, which makes claims to ultimate truth, which makes claims to the Four Noble Truths, and which I will argue is a model that is far more in alignment with traditional Indian religion than it is with the kind of civilizational practices that we find in this model of paths. So again, if we're to make this a simple distinction, monastic-based, truth-based, religious Buddhism has as its goal the attainment of nirvana, whereas the secular perspective, which is based on a task-based ethics of four distinctive paths, has as its goal the flourishing as a socially embedded human being. In other words, the Eightfold Path is the goal, not the attainment of nirvana. This is something that is of central importance to what I'm going to be teaching on this course. So don't forget that point. What I'm really arguing for is a different conception of what the goal of practice is. Now, as we probably already know, after Gautama died, his Dharma quite quickly mutated into another Indian religion. It adopted many of the same kind of structures, many of the same world views as we would also find in other Indian traditions such as Brahmanism, or loosely Hinduism, and Jainism. Because we must remember that the gaining liberation from the cycle of birth and death, realizing moksha or liberation, these are the goals not just of the Buddhist schools in India and China and Tibet, but they're also the goals of Brahmanism and Jainism as well. And so the many of these issues that we struggle with, rebirth, karma, are essentially not Buddhist ideas at all. They're ideas that were already current at the Buddha's time. Admittedly, they weren't as finely developed as they now come down to us through Buddhist teachings, but the basic outline of what it meant to practice Buddhism agreed with the basic outline of what it meant to be a Brahmin or a Jain. And in other words, Buddhism differed in India in its methodology, in its practices, in its philosophy, but the goals were the same. We do find, though, continuing this short history of secular Buddhism, a counter movement that emerged in India about 400 or 500 years after Gautama's death that we call the Mahayana. And the Mahayana movement, which is now the Buddhism of China and Japan, Korea, Tibet, rejected an emphasis in early Buddhism that was about renouncing the world, working only for your own liberation. And instead, it started putting far more emphasis on compassion rather than renunciation. And its core ethical idea, which is a very beautiful idea, is that of the bodhicitta. The bodhicitta means like the spirit or the mind of awakening that is committed to the altruistic practice of the Dharma in order to, liberate all beings from suffering, not just oneself. So I think there is an element within Mahayana Buddhism which is also a return to the world. And in that sense, I think it has resonances with our idea of secularity. The aim is actually to address the suffering that we find all around us in the world that we cohabit with so many, nowadays, millions of other people. So this shift to compassion, I think, is also the recovery of a more secular perspective on the Dharma. But we also have to remember that the broad worldview of Mahayana Buddhism is no different from the broad worldview of early Buddhism, of Brahmanism or Jainism. The Bodhisattva works for the liberation of all beings, and once they're liberated, once they've all entered nirvana, then the Bodhisattva too enters nirvana. In other words, nirvana is still the goal. The difference now is that it's a goal for all living beings, at least all human beings. But the basic paradigm remains the same. As I've already mentioned, I think another historical antecedent of secular Dharma began in China with the emergence of the Chan or Zen movement, which again was a break with tradition and an attempt to recover the primacy of the questions that motivate us rather than belief in a certain set of solutions and answers that Buddhism presents us with. So that too brings us back into the cut and the thrust of ordinary life. And as we saw with that citation from Deshan, this language can be very, very direct, very challenging. I think the next period where we find a secular move occurring in Buddhism is in 14th century Japan, and two figures in particular, Shinran and Nichiren, both of whom took issue with the Buddhism of its day, partly because they both felt Buddhism was too preoccupied with monastic life. It didn't pay sufficient attention to the actual dilemmas in the social world, that Shinran ceased to be a monk. He went to live in the working district of Kyoto and developed what is now known as the Pure Land school of Buddhism. And Nichiren was a monk of the same period. And he basically broke with his tradition of Dendai in order to advocate a form of practice that would be available to all people, irrespective of their walks of life, essentially chanting the name of the Lotus Sutra, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. And Nichiren basically felt that this was the only way forward with Buddhism of his day, if it were to flourish and survive under the social and the political conditions of his time. And we find today descendants of Nichiren in the form of the Soka Gakkai are again a very secular, inflected movement that is currently one of the most widespread and effective Buddhist movements in the world. But before we get to the Soka Gakkai in the 1920s, we need to consider what happened in 19th century Sri Lanka and Burma, both of which were colonies of Britain. And because of this colonial process, they sought to counter the British by recovering an approach to their own religious traditions that would give it a somehow more rational and what we might call Protestant approach to the Dharma, one that was also much more in alignment with the natural sciences. This is a movement that has become extremely influential in our world today because that is what gave birth to the whole mindfulness phenomenon that is so current, everywhere now. But it too was a secular movement. Vipassana and mindfulness meditation moved out of the monasteries into 10-day Vipassana retreats led in Rangoon or elsewhere. In Sri Lanka too, we find reformers like Dhammapala, again presenting a much more lay-friendly, science-respecting, rational Protestant approach that tried to, in a way, distance Buddhism from what they thought of as superstition, folk belief, and to try to bring it into the world that was emerging in the early 20th century. Another very important figure in what we might think of loosely as this secular tradition is Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar, who was the first justice minister of independent India and the person who helped frame the Indian constitution. He was a lawyer by training, and he was also from the caste of untouchables, which led him to convert to Buddhism as a way for his community of untouchables, or what we would now call Dalits, to be free of the caste strictures of Hinduism in India. He did not get on with Gandhi at all. Gandhi was quite committed to the caste system. Ambedkar felt that that was the blight that affected Indian society, and he saw the way out was to cease to identify as a Hindu and to, in his case, to convert to Buddhism, initially with 500,000 of his own followers, but he launched a movement that today is one of the largest social and political movements that we find in India, and it is now actually gaining real political power. Unfortunately, the caste system remains largely intact, and Dalits are still disenfranchised, persecuted, although the government does have policies in place to affirmatively give them positions in higher parts of society. But this is an ongoing process. In the West, Chogyam Trungpa founded the Shambhala training in the 1970s, which he saw as a secular counterpart to Tibetan Buddhism. After his death, Shambhala and Vajradhatu were unified, and that distinctive secular component became less evident. But nonetheless, Trungpa was someone who could see that a secular dimension was somehow needed if the Dharma were to thrive in a world such as ours. Far more recently, we find the Dalai Lama himself advocating what he calls a secular ethics. He describes this in his book called Beyond Religion, which is quite a provocative title to be written by the leading figure in one of the world's great religions. And his idea of secular ethics was actually inspired by the Indian constitution, which was formulated in large part by Ambedkar. And what the Dalai Lama sees as valuable in that constitution is a space of tolerance. For the Dalai Lama, secularity means the tolerance of all different religions without any one of them having, as it were, the authority of the state. And India, modern India, is thereby a secular state, although now with Mr. Modi and others in power, that is also experiencing its own tensions. But I find it quite interesting. I found it very confirming that the Dalai Lama quite independently picks up on the idea of secularity. Now, most of these movements that I've mentioned, although they gave a more secular emphasis to their teachings and their practices and their organizations, they didn't question the classical worldview of India with belief in rebirth and karma and nirvana. But what they did was they tended to push these ideas more into the margins. They didn't emphasize them to the degree to which they would have been in the past. And so if you went on a Vipassana course in India or in the West, you wouldn't hear much about karma and rebirth, but you'd get a lot of focus on practices like mindfulness and jhanas and metta and so on, which are largely about transforming the quality of your own personal life, helping to form communities that instantiated these values. And yet in the background, these basic Buddhist beliefs remain basically unquestioned. They're not emphasized, they may not be taught, but they also are still somehow there. Likewise, the model of the Four Noble Truths, this too remains. For Dr. Ambedkar, the Four Noble Truths were radically reinterpreted as a social and political doctrine. So suffering was caused not by craving, it was caused by the caste system, it was caused by various structures of social injustice. So he kept the basic framework of suffering and its causes, the end of suffering and the way to that, but he framed it in purely political terms. What we find in the mindfulness movement is also very often a secular reading of the Four Noble Truths. So instead of talking of suffering being birth, sickness, aging, death, and everything about what is unpleasant in life, in the mindfulness philosophy, suffering basically gets boiled down to avoidable mental anguish and distress. And very often this is explained through the notion of the second arrow. The first arrow causes you physical pain. The second arrow is all the unnecessary anguish and worry and so on that your mind then creates and then exacerbates the physical pain. So mindfulness is a way to no longer be entrapped in those mental habits, to be able to accept the basic physical pain of life, but to be less overwhelmed by the habits of mind that build upon that. But again, the Four Noble Truth model is not questioned. It's still the template that governs the perspective, even in a very secular practice of mindfulness. And again, I think we have to point out that although the Dalai Lama advocates a secular ethics, he certainly doesn't talk of a secular Buddhism. In fact, I think his Buddhism is quite explicitly regarded as one of the many religions that could thrive within a more secular space. He recognizes that some of the values of Buddhism could easily be adopted by non-Buddhists, like people who practice mindfulness or people who want to live according to the precepts of Buddhism. But he would not go so far as to suggest that Buddhism itself should imagine itself as a secular phenomenon. Now, the secular Dharma that we're going to be exploring on this course will seek to actually go deep down into the operating code of the Dharma in order to start all over again. The operating code of traditional Buddhism, I think we can summarize basically as the Four Noble Truths. There is suffering, that suffering has a cause. If you get rid of the cause, you'll attain freedom, and the Eightfold Path is the way to attain that freedom, nirvana, and thereby the problem of suffering is solved. That is like the DNA of traditional Buddhism. I'm arguing that the problem, not the problem, but I'm arguing that for a truly secular Dharma, we need a different operating code. The Four Noble Truths is perhaps past its sell-by date. It's too embedded in traditional Indian thinking. If we were to replace that with four tasks, or as I'll argue later, four paths, then we've effectively changed the operating system of the Dharma, and everything from that point will then look differently. And that might give rise to what we might call Buddhism 2.0 rather than Buddhism 1.0. It's not a question of fine-tuning some of the traditions to make them a bit more secular, but it's about imagining the possibility of thinking the Dharma in entirely secular concepts and language and ethics. So that's a brief history of secular Buddhism. Again, I only scratched the surface in many ways, but it perhaps gives you a sense, of where I'm coming from and what has inspired me in my approach. So I'd like, in the breakout groups that you are now going to join, for you to ask the following questions. What distinguishes for you Buddhism from the Dharma? And in yourself, would you say that you practice Buddhism, or would you say that you practice the Dharma? Let's try to explore for 20 minutes or so the tension, the difference, the compatibility or otherwise of Buddhism and the Dharma.